Today's book is A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. This is one of the scripted book review series in which I kind of go through my archives and find old book reports or book reviews that I make into YouTube videos. So A Tale of Two Cities, I first read an abridged version of this way back when I was, 10 or something like that. Not the original, but one of those classic illustrated editions. Quite liked it. And then in 12th grade we had to do a report on a classic. I forget exactly what the parameters were, but we had some choice to choose. And I chose A Tale of Two Cities, and this time read the original Dickens. I didn't tell my teacher I had already read an abridged version of it. I don't think she would have cared anyways. The book review structure, you had to kind of go through these checklists for like the first 7 things: book, author, genre, setting, and then finally you get to number 8 where you go into the book review. So I'll just list this off. Book, A Tale of Two Cities. Author, Charles Dickens. Genre, historical fiction. Setting. The book takes place in France and England during the late 1700s. Dickens probably described the mood of the book best himself when he wrote, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times." The book shows both hope and joy, contrasted with violence and hate. Characters. Lucie Manette, a young English lady with long golden curls. She has a forehead that moves when she thinks too hard, and most men find this attractive. Perfect in almost anything, she is extremely devoted to her father, and to a lesser extent her husband. She cries easily and doesn't take shocking news well. Charles Darnay, a perfect gentleman. He is a French nobleman by nature, but lives in England. He is unique among his kind meaning the French aristocracy, in that he actually cares for the poor. He's a very caring person, as evidenced by his attitudes towards Lucy. Sidney Carton. He looks exactly like Darnay. He feels like his life has been wasted. He has an excellent memory and is a valuable asset to his friend Stryver. Dickens frequently compares Carton to a jackal. The theme. The theme is that all life is important. In the beginning, the aristocrats treat the peasant's life as nothing. After the revolution, the peasants see the aristocrat's life as nothing. But Sidney Carton, spoilers. Sidney Carton, whose own life has been wasted, makes the ultimate sacrifice to protect the life of his friend. Rating. On a scale of 1 to 10, I would give this book an 8. Most of it was very interesting, such as the French Revolution bits and all the spy bits. I did, however, find some parts to be a bit dry, and I'll discuss this more in the next part. Alright, and then the actual book review. A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens was overall a good book. As Dickens himself states when the book first opens, these were turbulent and interesting times, and his stories of lovers caught in these times is fascinating. Now, in the review, I'm going to complain about stuff, but I don't want to give a negative impression about this book. It's only because it's easier to complain about the negatives than the positives. I did actually really like this book. So yeah, I think that's something I wrote here back when I was in high school. That's true even today. If there's a book or movie you really enjoy, at least for me, I find it hard to put my finger on exactly what I enjoyed. You know it was entertaining, or it was moving, but why? That's harder to dissect. Whereas kind of going all through all the plot holes and kind of the stuff that felt a bit off is much easier to put your finger on. So for that reason, my reviews tend to be much more negative, even when I did tend to like the book. This is a perfect example. Okay, the book takes place in both London and Paris, hence the title, Tale of Two Cities, in the late 1700s. The French Revolution is the background against which this story unfolds. So the book is historical fiction. I suspect Dickens has taken a lot of liberties with the history involved. I haven't done any research, so I can't say for certain, but I'm pretty sure most of his characters are fictitious, and so the important role they played in the French Revolution in Dickens' books never actually occurred in real life. Yeah, actually, since I wrote that when I was 17, I know a bit more about history now. I can address this somewhat. So in the book, when you're reading it, the character like Madame Defarge appears to be like one of the main powers behind the French Revolution. So, I'm reading this at the age of 17, I'm thinking, did Madame Defarge really exist? I mean, like, it seems in the book like she was kind of driving everything. If she wasn't driving everything, who was, right? But yeah, I know now that all these characters were fictitious. Madame Defarge never existed. It was kind of interweaved with some real historical events. So, I guess the part that sticks most in memory, right, is when there's that big massacre of all the prisoners. The aristocrats are being held prisoners somewhere. I forget where the aristocrats were being held prisoner, but then everyone kind of ran in and massacred all the aristocrat prisoners. And that's described in somewhat vivid detail in the book. And was actually a real historical event, although I think Dickens has been accused of exaggerating some of this to kind of set up his theme. A good essay to read on this is Orwell. Orwell wrote an essay kind of critiquing Dickens' handling of the history of the French Revolution. I forget the exact name of the essay, but just Google Orwell and Dickens. Okay, anyways. Throughout the book, Dickens had an eye for detail that sometimes irritated me. I would be anxious to get on with the story, but Dickens would be describing something in more detail than I cared to know about. His lengthy descriptions about how old-fashioned Tellison's bank is, for instance, something I could have done without. It also seemed terribly inconsistent to me. Here Dickens would describe a few minutes in great detail. Here he would cover 6 years in a few paragraphs, such as when he was telling about how Lucie and Charles had one daughter and then a son, and the son died a few years after he was born. Yeah, that's something that still puzzles me, actually, in the years since when I've reread this book. You remember this part, maybe. There's scene after scene that gets described in minute detail, and all of a sudden, kind of 6 years is just kind of very briefly covered. And Dickens says, yeah, they had one daughter and then they had a son who died. And I always thought, well, what was the point of having that son die? I mean, it never comes back to anything. I mean, I guess maybe true to life, maybe infant mortality rates were higher in that period, but it just kind of seemed like pointless to have that son die. And then the whole thing was just covered in like a couple short paragraphs anyways, and then we're 6 years later. I don't know. But better too much description than too little, I suppose. I wonder. And compared with some other books I've read, Dickens wasn't really all that bad. Now, actually, I remember this. My high school teacher kind of wrote in the margins when she handed this back to me. Dickens got paid by the word, which is why some of these descriptions were so lengthy. And I believed that for quite some time. It turns out that's one of these kind of common rumors. And I don't blame my high school teacher for this, because this was kind of before the days of the internet, or the internet was just in its infancy back then. So nowadays it's kind of much easier to just kind of look all these factoids up online than it was back then in the mid-90s. But Dickens was actually paid by the installment, not the word. But he did kind of have an interest in kind of padding out each installment to kind of fill it up to like an installment length, I guess. Anyways, as to the plot, the ending was painfully obvious, even from the beginning of the book. Yeah, I wrote that. I was cheating a little bit, though, because I actually had read an abridged version of this as a younger child. So I didn't remember all the details, but I did kind of remember where the ending was going to. I wonder if I had kind of approached this book completely with a blank slate, if the ending would have been quite so obvious. But kind of knowing where it was going, it seemed painfully obvious that Dickens was setting up some sort of switch between Darnay and Carton. He was just emphasizing their similarities way too much. The fact that Sidney Carton felt his life was a waste was emphasized so much, it became obvious he would perform some great act of self-sacrifice before the end of the book to redeem himself. Also, the fact that he told Lucie he would gladly sacrifice his life for someone he loves adds to the feeling of inevitability. And of course, the incredible coincidence that Carton and Darnay look exactly alike, which I always felt was a bit unbelievable. It was just too big of a coincidence, so you knew it had to be used in some way that would affect the plot. But, while I may have seen that part coming, Dickens did have plenty of other surprises that I did not expect. For example, I did not expect that Mrs. Pross's brother, Solomon, would turn out to be John Barsad. Nor did I expect that Roger Cly would still be alive. And I also didn't expect the whole story about why Dr. Manette had been locked up in the Bastille in the first place. And finally, the biggest surprise to me was that Madame Defarge was the last surviving member of the peasant family that had been victimized by the Evrémonds. Without a doubt, my favorite section of the book were those dealing with the Defarges and the Jacques, and the rest of the French Revolution parts. All those secret signals the Jacques had, such as Madame Defarge putting a rose in her hair to indicate when a spy was present, and the way they had hidden the contacts all over to obtain information, it just reminded me of like one of those old spy movies. And I thought that the revolution was a noble cause for which they were working, which made me feel sympathetic to them. Even near the end of the book, when it became obvious that they had gone too far and they were now kind of the bad guys and the antagonists of our main hero, I never quite grew to hate them. I think I would have enjoyed this book initially more if it had been all about the Jacques and the Defarges as the main characters, instead of Lucie Manette and Charles Darnay. As for Lucie Manette and Charles Darnay, they were, in my opinion, the most boring of the whole book. Jerry Cruncher was humorous, Carton was a likable scoundrel, and even Mr. Lorry was amusing in his way, as a man who had just dedicated his whole life to his business. Every character in the whole book has some sort of quirk to make them interesting, except for the main characters, Charles and Lucie. When they spoke, it was much too formal and polite, and not at all like real people talk. Also, they were much too perfect. They could always be counted on to do the right thing and didn't have any signs of human fallibles in their moral character. Take, for instance, Lucie's extreme devotion to her father, or Darnay's sense of responsibility. I guess the only time you could fault either one of them was on Darnay's unwise decision to return to France. Now, about that decision to return to France. That decision reminded me of like when you're watching a horror movie, right? So in a horror movie, the audience knows that there's going to be this big danger waiting for a character if they go into a certain room or go to a certain place or do a certain thing. And usually all the logic in the movie is just screaming at the character not to do this thing, which is going to set off the danger. Yet at the same time, the audience kind of ultimately knows that they will go there because it's a horror movie. So you've got to have something to set the plot in motion. Like, it's, you know, not going to have 2 hours of nothing, right? This was the same thing with Darnay's decision to return to France. You knew it was a bad idea, but you knew he was still going to do it anyways. From the moment the Defarges were talking about the great danger that would await Darnay if he ever returned to France, I knew he would somehow end up back there. Darnay's decision does not seem particularly logical either. The narrator states Darnay felt shamed by the remarks made by the aristocrats and Stryver, but Darnay never seemed worried about their opinions before. I mean, earlier in the book, he had rejected his life with the aristocrats, He had turned down Stryver's children as his pupils, so why does he care about Stryver's opinion now? Sure, his servant, Gabelle, was in danger, but as a member of the aristocracy, Darnay must have realized there was nothing he could have done to save him anyways. Finally, Darnay was taken by surprise by the extreme political situation and the new laws when he arrived in France. Why didn't he bother to research this before he left England? So, that's all my complaints. Having expressed the book's faults, I think it wise to close the same way I started. Just saying again that this book was very good, and I enjoyed reading it, and I'm sorry I harped on the negatives too much. So yeah, that was a report I wrote back in 12th grade. This book, for all its faults, and I still do mostly agree with kind of what I wrote there, remains kind of one of my favorite books of all time. Maybe some of this is kind of nostalgia setting in, where I'm not kind of clearly analyzing it critically because I just remember it as something I enjoyed in my youth. When I was in Japan, at one point, I took with me a set of audiobooks, 5 of them, which I would play over and over and over again, kind of driving around Japanese countryside. I had these long drives kind of to and from work and stuff like that. Of the 5 I brought with me, the audiobook of Tale of Two Cities was one of them. So through kind of the years, I don't know, 2005 through to, I kept this with me till about 2008. I listened to this book over and over and over and over again. It was kind of one of 5 audiobooks on rotation in my car. And I found I appreciated it a lot more on audiobook. Part of that was a narrator whose name I don't remember, but you know, they get these professional narrators for the voice actors to read the audiobooks, and they're quite good. And the stuff that had irritated me in the past, you know, the pages and pages of description, this voice actor doing the narration of this audiobook was quite good at it. So as you kind of listen to it, you kind of got into the rhythm of it, and it didn't irritate me. In fact, I quite enjoyed it. The other thing I began to notice as I was listening to this book on repeat is there were some dramatic scenes in this movie which just seemed tailor-made for Hollywood. And even the way Dickens was describing these scenes seemed like a Hollywood screenplay. I thought that was interesting. You know, something that I've wondered from time to time is how much has the age of movies influenced the current novels now? You know, like we all grow up on movies. So when authors write nowadays, are they kind of thinking with a cinematic camera in the back of their mind? You know, cut to this person, cut to that person. I don't know. Well, I don't know really. It's something that I think about from time to time, but I've not done any research on it or anything. But it's interesting to read Dickens' book, which was well before anyone was even thinking about movies. And some of these courtroom scenes, Dickens can be kind of quite sharp when he wants to be, where he's kind of directing the reader's attention, you know, now this character was doing this, now you look across the room and Sidney Carton was writing notes, then this note got passed, and you're not kind of bogged down in details, and you're not kind of bogged down kind of knowing the character's thought process. It's just kind of very quick notes passed back and forth. Or like there's some reveals during the end where it turns out like a long lost brother was a spy all along, or Sidney Carton is confronting these spies. And just kind of very sharp dialogue. I think, oh man, this would make a great movie. And I know it's already been done as a movie like 3 or 4 times, and probably a BBC production and stuff like that. But I thought it should get like the modern Hollywood treatment. So anyways, back in 2005, I wrote another blog post on this, which I'll just kind of throw into this video. Even though actually I think I just said everything I wanted to say. I'll just read it anyways, but fair warning, you can stop the video here because I'm just going to repeat what I just said. So here's another observation. I just finished rereading A Tale of Two Cities. That's a lie. I just finished re-listening to it on audiobook. And it strikes me that this should be made into a movie. I mean, I know it's already been made into a movie, like back in the 60s or whatever. But it should be made into a movie again, like a modern, big-budget Hollywood movie. So much of the book just reads like a movie anyways. It would be perfect for the big screen. I've often wondered if books are different now than they were before the advent of movies. Most people watch more movies than they read books, so perhaps today's authors find themselves heavily influenced by the big screen and write books that start to resemble screenplays. I don't know. I've not done any research into this question or attempted to kind of compare literature across time periods or anything like that. It's just a thought that wanders into my brain sometimes. Perhaps some of you who have studied literature and know more about this than I do can shed some light on this question. But the interesting thing about Dickens' book is that well before the invention of movies, already this book is resembling a screenplay in parts. I mean, not all of it. There are a lot of long and windy parts, and I'm told Dickens got paid by the word. That's wrong. Got paid by the installment. And there are a lot of parts that would have to be chopped out to make the transition to the screen. But the parts that would be left could very easily transfer to the screen. Yeah, I'm thinking of some of the courtroom scenes specifically, or the scenes that take place in Paris. That's a little bit ambiguous. There's a lot of the scenes that take place in Paris. I'm thinking about some of the denouement scenes where you kind of find out a character's secret that take place in Paris. The characters seem to talk to each other in memorable one-liners, and the drama is built up in the conversation, leading towards some sort of revelation. And the way most of the story is revealed by the character's dialogue and not by the author's narration. It just seems like it would all be perfect for the screen. So, yeah. Wrote that back in 2005. Still kind of waiting for a big budget modern Hollywood film of The Tale of Two Cities. I don't know, maybe it would be a disaster. But there are at least certain scenes that just seem so cinematic. Okay, I'll finish here.